Hey. Huh?
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Well, we continue to track this morning Western North Carolina, and they're continuing recovery efforts surrounding Hurricane Helene. That storm ravaged the area, bringing driving rain and wind. As of this morning, we do have an unfortunate update. The death total in Buncombe County, that's where Asheville is located, currently sits at 40, and search and rescue operations, not only in Buncombe County, but across all of Western North Carolina, are continuing. On a positive note, power is being restored to some customers. Statewide outages are currently at 377,000. And while, yes, that number is high, when we were on the air yesterday morning, that number was over 457,000. So you're looking at a chunk of about 80 or so thousand individuals that have power today that didn't yesterday. President Joe Biden is visiting North Carolina on Wednesday to survey the catastrophic damage. We'll have more details with Donna King from the Carolina Journal coming up in just a few minutes. For the first time in nearly 50 years, longshoremen on the East and Gulf Coasts went on strike early this morning, a move that will cut off most of the trade through some of the busiest ports in the United States and could send crippling effects through the U.S. economy. Members of the International Longshoremen's Association Union, which represents about 45,000 workers, started setting up pickets after 11th hour talks failed to avert a work stoppage. According to Harold Daggett, who is the president of the union, he said, "Nothing is going to move without us. Nothing." Jeff Moore from the Carolina Journal will join us with additional details coming up here a little bit later on in the program. It's now 5:07 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It has been a rough couple of days for folks out in the western half of North Carolina. To get the latest details that we're tracking this morning, Donna King from the Carolina Journal joins us on the News Hour. Donna, unfortunately, you wish you could say that things are improved. It's still dire straits out in the western half of the state.
It really is. We passed a grim milestone Tuesday afternoon, 107 deaths so far from the impact of Hurricane Helene. Of those, about 35 in western North Carolina, much of that in Buncombe County. But still, authorities are saying that number is still going to rise as they get through to these spaces, these places, these areas where roads have been washed out and houses have just been flooded. So while we say right now 35 deaths in North Carolina, I anticipate, and certainly the officials anticipate, that really is going to climb in the coming days as they find out the true extent of the damage.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time yesterday. We talked a little bit about it on Friday. The infrastructure, we're talking about roads, cell phones, and all that stuff's damaged. But Don, it seems like we're up against a humanitarian clock at this point. There's folks that haven't had food or water for 4 or 5 days now. This is a huge issue that's unfolding as we speak this morning.
It really is. One of the interesting things that always comes out of this is you see how communities try to reach out and help. Most of the calls that I've been getting really here in Carolina Journal have been people who say, I have a plane or I have a helicopter or I have access to flats of water. What do I do with it? How do I get it there? So we're trying to connect people in our office with the resources to land a plane somewhere or get materials up there. And we're finding now that Asheville Regional Airport, while open, is requiring some FEMA clarification or FEMA certification to land. So it looks like some goods are getting passed through Statesville Airport, Hickory, areas like that, and getting trucked in there. But just the logistics of getting some of those basic supplies to the West it's just a really, really difficult thing right now. And when you start factoring in government, that makes it even harder. We heard comments from President Joe Biden. Initially, he said there would not be extra money for this on Sunday, and extra support. But now on Monday, sort of walking that back in comments to the press, saying that the federal government will be with the victims of Hurricane Helene as long as it takes. But really right now, it's more about speed, getting that water, getting power hooked up, and getting internet connection to those folks is critical right now.
I was listening to a briefing yesterday morning from Buncombe County officials. They reported that they asked for some of these additional supplies late last week, and their first water delivery, Donna, did not roll in until 2:30 Monday morning in Buncombe County. It's unfortunate to say, not to politicize the event, but that's a long span of time between Friday and Monday morning for this water to roll in.
That's a time span that's life and death. I mean, that's
Absolutely.
a huge issue in the logistics of getting these crises, mitigated, the damage from these crises mitigated. A lot of folks online and in X have been talking about how Florida handled it versus how this is going. And mountain terrain makes a huge difference because we're talking about a lot of roads washed out, water from dams being released, particularly there along the Catawba River. Those dams, people are now able to get back after the water was released into Lake Norman. It created some flooding to try and alleviate the pressure there. So really, we're watching that water now come down into the Piedmont area of North Carolina. There's even flood warnings down in Columbia, South Carolina. So this isn't over. People are still getting the damage there, and getting supplies to them has proven to be a huge obstacle.
Going back to the infrastructure, hearing from officials across the western half of the state this morning that water treatment plants, underground, above ground pipes, Donna, they're gone. Duke Energy talking about entire electrical grids completely wiped off the map. You do have to start wondering, when do you turn from weeks to months for the recovery on some of this?
Sure, absolutely. And a lot of people are, certainly life and death is the important thing right now, making sure we save the people and get help to them. But there's also people saying, how is this going to impact the November election, which seems a little early to be talking about that, but it really is kind of on the minds of folks who have to manage elections and the state board of elections. How are they going to handle the whole western part of the state? So those decisions are being hashed out now. We're going to have a story on CarolinaJournal.com later today about that. But right now, the focus really is on recovering and rescuing people. We're seeing people airlifted out in private helicopter, FEMA helicopters, North Carolina National Guard. It's become kind of an all hands on deck, but that mountain terrain is really difficult to manage.
As we continue to track the details out of the western half of the state this morning, Donna, we talked about the communication aspect. We heard from President Trump yesterday afternoon that he's in talk with Elon Musk to roll even more Starlink out to that area so that folks can send a little pulse and get a little lifeline to their family member and friends that, yes, we're okay. We are just unable to communicate.
Starlink actually has proven to be kind of a bright spot in this because Starlink, if you don't know, is a satellite internet service that is, the company was run by Elon Musk, really designed for kind of this situation, or really to drop it in areas that don't have access to broadband or hard wired internet. These systems work off of a satellite. There were folks who already had it in place there in the mountains. If they couldn't get internet service, they rolled it out in the hours around that hurricane and Helene, dumping water, sometimes 29 inches of rain in some parts of North Carolina, and they worked. They just plugged it in if they could. They got it hooked to a generator, and they were getting internet service. So those systems are popping up around the area. And of course, Trump mentioning that they're getting more of them, and they're helping police and local rescuers get to the people who need it. So people are able to post hey, we need a helicopter rescue on this rooftop on Twitter or on X. And then, by Starlink, they're able to get that message out. So that really has been an interesting way that has transformed the rescue effort.
Donna, and a lot of folks listening this morning still wondering what they can do. There's some resources available. Where do folks go for that?
Absolutely. You can head over to johnlocke.org. We've got a list of trusted resources. Certainly, there's also on the governor's website a place where you can donate money as well to hurricane recovery effort. But there's also a group called Operation Airdrop, I believe. If you do have access to aerial equipment, airplanes, helicopters, that kind of thing, where they're trying to coordinate bringing in those supplies. So if you go to any of those websites, and including johnlocke.org, there are some resources there to track down ways that you can help.
We'll continue to follow the latest breaking details over at CarolinaJournal.com. 514 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Let's get a look at the roads this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. News Talk 1110 and 99.3
WBT.
It's 5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Also streaming live this morning on the Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Continuing to track details out of the western half of North Carolina this morning. Recovery efforts are continuing as the western half of the state was drenched with rain and wind. It looks like an absolute war zone in many areas of the state. We did learn last night, unfortunately, that Helene's death toll now stands at 40 individuals in Buncombe County. That raises the total number of people killed across the United States from this storm at 133. Officials in western North Carolina fearing that number could continue to rise. Power outages are one of the positive notes this morning, in which there are not many. Yesterday morning when we were on the air, there were 457,000 customers without power across the state of North Carolina. That number is now at 377,000. Fortunately, food and water distributions began in areas in the western half of the state yesterday. Those distribution centers were providing people with food and water as, the storm hit on Friday. Many folks going days without water in parts of those areas. We also learned from officials in Buncombe County yesterday that Interstate 26 in western North Carolina is now open as well. That is good news for folks trying to deliver goods and services to that area. There's some staging areas in and around the Buncombe County area where things are then being airlifted to more remote portions of western North Carolina. We'll continue to track the details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Well, we could be in for a very interesting situation surrounding ports on the East Coast and Gulf Coast. For the first time in nearly 50 years, longshoremen are on strike. That happened at 12:01 this morning, and this move is set to cut off most of the trade through some of the busiest U.S. ports and could have a major impact on the U.S. economy. Members of the International Longshoremen's Association Union, which represents roughly 45,000 workers, set up a picket line in various ports starting last night just before midnight. Negotiation talks absolutely crumbled and failed, and now, those some 45,000 individuals are on strike. Members of the International Longshoremen's Association are striking over pay, and businesses are now face a period of rather uncertainty. Trade experts say that a short strike, which of course this would be day one of, would cause little lasting damage, but if this was to go on for weeks, it could lead to shortages, high prices, and even layoffs in some areas. The prospect of any significant economic damage from a strike puts President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris in a quandary just 5 weeks before the presidential election. Before the strike, President Biden said he was not going to use a federal labor law to force an end to the port shutdown, something that President George W. Bush did in 2002. But some labor experts said that he might use that power if the strike started to weigh on the U.S. economy. White House officials had pressed both sides to reach a deal before the strike. That was unsuccessful. It's now 5:23 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Tracking some other news this morning, a man from Greensboro. His name is Ryan Ruth. He is the center of attention after a second attempted assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump. Yesterday in Florida, he pled not guilty to 5 federal charges, including an attempted assassination of a former president. Ruth, who is originally from Greensboro, appeared in a Florida courtroom Monday for an arraignment that lasted just a few minutes. In addition to the initial federal charges filed at his arrest, Ruth is charged with attempted assassination of a major presidential candidate, possessing a firearm in the furtherance of a crime of violence, and assaulting a federal officer. As you can imagine, he is being held without bail. Florida's Deputy Attorney General Lisa McCanno said this alleged attempted assassination of former President Trump at his golf course was a direct attack on our democracy. Political violence has no place in this country. Not then, not now, not ever. The charges today reflect the department's continued resolve to deploy every available resource to ensure public officials remain safe and to hold accountable those who target public officials to the fullest extent of the law. Ruth was arrested following the attempted assassination on September the 15th at Trump's golf course in West Palm Beach, Florida. The indictment at the time included possession of a firearm with an obliterated serial number. Ruth was allegedly hiding near the golf course armed with a high-power long-distance rifle before being spotted by Secret Service agents. Though the agents opened fire, Ruth fled and was later apprehended on Interstate 95 after a short pursuit. Entered into evidence, investigators used data from Ruth's cell phone to show that he'd traveled from North Carolina to Florida on August the 14th, about a month before his arrest. They also used some of that same cellular data to show that Ruth lured for about 12 hours in what is being described as a makeshift sniper's nest near hole 6 on the Trump International Golf Course on September the 15th. Other evidence also had a list of Trump's public appearances and had been monitoring his activity for weeks before the incident. Now, Ruth has a lengthy criminal history of firearm-related offenses, including a 2002 North Carolina conviction for possessing a weapon of mass destruction. He was also known for his vehement opposition to former President Donald Trump. He was highly critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and worked on the ground there to recruit fighters to defend Ukraine. According to the Department of Justice, a civilian witness came forward after Ruth's arrest, saying he'd left a box at his house several months ago. In it, Ruth left a handwritten note addressed "Dear World." In that note, Ruth allegedly admitted that his actions were an assassination attempt on Donald Trump and expressed regret for his failure. So that is the latest that we are tracking on Ryan Ruth this morning. Again, the individual originally from North Carolina, spent some time here in the early 2000s, racking up a lengthy criminal rap sheet. He then allegedly moved to Hawaii, where he spent some time there, also as reporting, spending some time over in parts of Ukraine during that conflict, and then his final stop making his way to Florida back a middle part of September in that attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. The judge in Monday's arraignment was Magistrate Judge Bruce Reinhart, who was also the federal judge who signed a search warrant in 2022 for the raid of Trump's residence at Mar-a-Lago. So something interesting there. Ruth's son, Orrin Ruth, was also arrested in late September on charges related to child pornography after federal authorities found hundreds of illicit images during a raid on his house following his father's arrest. Orrin also has publicly expressed his sentiments, his anti-Trump sentiments, and initially defended his father, though both face serious legal challenges ahead. It's now 5:28 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
expert tree care specialist for WBT and for you.
WBT's Talktoberfest 2024 is underway. Join us every Monday and Wednesday in Talktober at 7 p.m. on the WBT Facebook Live page for a fun discussion of everything that's going on, not only across Charlotte, but of course across the country with this upcoming elections. Get your questions ready and join us every Monday and Wednesday from September the 30th to Talktober 28th. It's WBT's Talktoberfest 2024, presented by Craft Body Scan. Visit WBT.com for more details. 5:34 Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Continuing to track additional details this morning out of Western North Carolina as recovery efforts continue. That area absolutely ravaged by Hurricane Helene late last week. In some areas, more than 29 inches of rain fell, causing mass amounts of flash flooding, interstates washing away land and mudslides, taking out roadways and trapping communities. Unfortunately, I have to report this morning that the death toll in Buncombe County, that's where Asheville is located, has risen to 40, with the storm killing over 130 people in the United States. Search and rescue operations do continue across the western half of the state this morning. Power, however, is being restored to some customers. Statewide power outages currently sit at 377,000, and while that number is still quite high, that number was over 457,000 yesterday morning. One of the big things discussed yesterday was getting mass feeding and water distribution sites set up across the western area of North Carolina, and that in fact did happen with many counties rolling out these locations, obviously with some individuals being unable to travel to those centralized locations. Helicopter missions are continuing essentially around the clock to deliver food and supplies to individuals that remain trapped by the either roadways washed out, continued rising floodwaters, whatever it be. Those operations do continue. President Joe Biden will be in North Carolina tomorrow to survey that catastrophic damage left behind. Governor Roy Cooper, alongside the FEMA administrator, were in Asheville yesterday surveying that damage and providing an update to individuals as well. Ryan Ruth has pled not guilty to 5 federal charges, including attempting to assassinate former President Donald Trump. Ruth, who is originally from Greensboro, appeared in a Florida courtroom yesterday for an arraignment that lasted just a few minutes. In addition to the initial federal charges filed when he was arrested, Ruth is charged with attempted assassination of a major presidential candidate, possessing a firearm in the furtherance of a crime of violence, and assaulting a federal officer. He is currently being held without bail this morning. It's now 5:37 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. A strike is now underway from ports from Maine all the way to Texas. Jeff Moore with the Carolina Journal's got more details this morning. Jeff, we talked about it late last week that this strike was looming. I guess no movement over the weekend. Here we are Tuesday morning, and the strike is now on. What are the latest details that you're learning?
Yeah, so they weren't able to come to an agreement, which is not necessarily surprising, from the International Longshoremen's Association and the United States Maritime Alliance. They hadn't met in person since June of this year. So the fact that this deadline came and went and there was no agreement isn't terribly surprising. What is surprising is that this wasn't a bigger blip on the radar of lots of groups coming into this strike. But now that we've got strikes at all the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports, we've got about 36 ports in all. It's about 45,000 workers that are striking. And we're seeing estimates of anywhere from $2 billion to $5 billion a day in value lost for every day that these ports are closed due to the strike.
For folks here in North Carolina, we've got 2 ports. One of them is a little bit smaller. The big one is the Port of Wilmington. Jeff, there's a lot of traffic that moves through that port. That port took over a lot of traffic from the Baltimore Bridge collapse. That area has really seen a huge boom down in portions of southeastern North Carolina. I guess everything's just stopped down there now as this, strike goes on.
Yeah, so the Port of Wilmington is the larger port in North Carolina, and they've got a gate that handles containerized operations. and you've got a high ILA union member presence there. And so when the work stoppage went into effect, that gate closed. All ships that were looking to berth at the port to unload containers would not be allowed in unless they had prior approval. Even things like the refrigerated units that are on the port site and in the warehouses, keeping some of the produce, some of the things that need temperature control to keep that at temperature, those things aren't allowed to be monitored during the strike either. So you might have product losses piling up if this goes on for too long. Typically, these things, if they're more and more economically painful, you have a higher incentive to actually get them solved. But so far, it doesn't look like the Biden administration is making any headway in closing a deal. The ILA has resisted pressure for the federal authorities to get involved to actually help negotiate a deal. And the Biden administration has indicated that they're not interested in utilizing it's the Taft-Hartley Act. It was passed in 1947. It actually allows the president to step in and suspend a strike for about 80 days for a cooling off period when it affects national or security or public safety. So reporters asking him if they're interested in doing that, and so far they are not interested in doing that. They're interested in supporting the unions, however long they may be striking.
Let's talk about the impacts of that strike for what you were just talking about with cold storage. Safe to assume that meat, produce, things that you're finding on the grocery store shelves soon, Jeff, if this continues to go on, might be far and few in between?
Yeah, and so when we look at the importers and who's importing the most, we see businesses like Walmart as the number one importer. So if you've got low and middle income Americans looking for those kind of goods at a Walmart and some of these the low price retailers, that's where you're going to go, and they're going to be the ones facing some of the biggest problems. And also some of the things that we import the most of. Things like bananas, which is America's kind of favorite fruit. I think the port in Delaware actually imports more bananas than any other port. That's going to be suspended. So things like fruit, fresh produce, anything that needs refrigeration that's coming in, furniture, things like this. We've just had disasters in western North Carolina, and there's going to be a lot of rebuilding that needs to be going on. And a lot of the materials that you use in rebuilding and putting towns back together after disasters like this are going to come through the ports. Now, there are some allowances for military movement of goods. That the union has a policy of always treating the military shipments first, and they're going to keep doing that even when they're on strike here. But you got to wonder about the downstream effects of all of this work stoppage at the ports just when we really need a lot of materials for safety reasons, rebuilding reasons, but also in front of the fourth quarter holiday season and building up inventories.
That was exactly going to be my next question. Christmas, the holiday time of the year, will soon enough be on people's minds. And while it's not life or death, you add a little bit more pain to the Christmas piggy bank, Jeff. You've got Americans that are already struggling. You can't imagine this is going to help them in any way, shape, or form.
No, not at all. Just when they're starting to brush off the paper to make those Christmas lists for their kids, they're wondering if they're going to have enough money to get the list, because we've already had inflation for the last 2 or 3 years, and now you're going to have some product shortages and price increases. That's what the retailers in North Carolina were most worried about. And on top of that, you've got some materials that can really be life or death for people, because you've got medical supplies that are actually coming in through these ports and everything like that. So it's the wrong time to have a strike, and also a really bad time to have an indefinite period. They're really not close on this deal. The United States Maritime Alliance apparently offered about a 40% salary increase on average for these union members. The union was actually looking for something closer to 70 or 80%. And again, they haven't met in person since June, so there's no real indication that they've come any closer on that. So we're going to just be kind of hanging by a thread here as the work stoppage continues to see how many things pile up at our ports and how much pain is actually caused before they actually come to an agreement.
Jeff Moore joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. And while there is stoppages at the port, let's see what's going on out on the roads this morning. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Boomer Von Cannon's got the latest on traffic.
Hey, thank you, Nick. And Indian Trail.
Hot. 5:48 now, 5:49. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, streaming live on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel this morning as well. We are tracking some news across the state this morning, and even some news that could have some big-time impacts here across the entire United States. What is that? Well, shutdowns at a major port. For the first time in nearly 50 years, longshoremen on the east and Gulf coasts went on strike. That happened early this morning, shortly after midnight, and that is a move that could cut off most of the trade through some of the busiest ports in the United States. And what could that mean? Well, it could send huge impacts throughout the U.S. economy. Members of the International Longshoremen's Association, which is a union representing about 45,000 workers, started setting up pickets after 11th hour talks failed to avert a work stoppage. According to Harold Daggett, who is the president of the union, addressing a crowd outside of the port terminal in Elizabeth, New Jersey yesterday, he said, "Nothing's going to move without us. Nothing." And that stoppage, again, took place right after midnight when the calendar flipped over to October. The real question is, how long is something like this going to take place? Looking at some of the other details with this, the prospect here of a significant economic issue ahead of the presidential election, you have to imagine, is on the minds of somebody like President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Before the strike, President Biden said he was not going to use a federal labor law to force an end to the port shutdown, which is something that George Bush did back in 2002. But some labor experts said that, well, if things get worse, supply chain starts bogging down, shortages start taking place, well, he might use that power if it starts having a major weight on the U.S. economy. And for businesses, well, now they face rather uncertain times. Trade experts say that a short strike, which obviously is ongoing right now, would cause little lasting damage, but that if this was to go on for weeks, if not months, that could lead to major shortages, higher prices, and even layoffs in sectors that are associated with this major work stoppage. So ports all along the East Coast, including the port here in Wilmington and the port in Morehead City, those are the two major ports in North Carolina. They are at a work stoppage this morning. We'll continue to track the latest details over at carolinajournal.com. Tracking some other statewide news this morning, or statewide connection is probably a better term to use. Ryan Ruth, the man from Greensboro, who tried to kill former President Donald Trump middle part of last month, pled not guilty to 5 federal charges. He appeared in a Florida courtroom on Monday for an arraignment that lasted just a few minutes. In addition to the initial federal charges that were filed when he was arrested back on September the 16th, Ruth is charged with attempted assassination of a major presidential candidate, possessing a firearm in the furtherance of a crime of violence, and assaulting a federal officer. Ruth, who is currently being held without bail in Florida, again, originally from Greensboro, allegedly living in Hawaii for a period of time. Important to note, he had a lengthy criminal rap sheet here in North Carolina dating back to the late 90s and early 2000s, one of which he was charged with possessing a weapon of mass destruction. Additional details available over at carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:52 on the Carolina Journal News Hour, turning our attention to what is on so many minds here across North Carolina and really across the country. The unbelievable damage and destruction left in the path of Hurricane Helene. The storm ravaged portions of western North Carolina on Friday, bringing some 29 inches of rain in some areas. That caused rivers and streams to flood over their banks, caused massive land and mudslides throughout the area. It has been an absolute mess out in the western portion of the state. As of this morning, I do have to report that the death count in Buncombe County, that's where Asheville is located, has risen to 40. And crews are reporting that search and rescue operations are continuing across the region. One positive note is the power situation. And while there are still 377,000 customers in North Carolina without power, that number is decreasing. Yesterday, this time, there were over 457,000 customers without power. So obviously, crews are on the scene. But we saw a post on the X yesterday from Jeff Brooks with Duke Energy. He posted a picture of some damaged power lines and said in certain areas of the state, the entire electrical infrastructure is going to have to be completely rebuilt. Turning our attention to the humanitarian crisis that's going on right now, some folks have been trapped since Friday, their food and water supplies dwindling. At a press conference yesterday morning in Buncombe County, again, that's where Asheville is located, officials talked about that they requested some of these products ahead of the storm and only found out that they were going to be getting them a little bit later on.
The message that we would say is that we've been asking for water and we just getting water and it's still in low quantities. There's a large need in our community, and we would like to see a different response from our state partners, a better response from our state partners. That would be the message from the staff's perspective. And this afternoon, we would have our elected officials with us, and I have not asked them what their response would be, but from a staff's perspective, our response would be clearly, we've been asking, we've been requesting, we've been following protocol since this storm began, and to this morning at 2:30 a.m. was the first delivery of water to our community.
This morning that she was referring to was yesterday morning. Monday around 2:30 a.m. is when that first water supply made its way to Asheville, as she noted, in low quantity. Governor Roy Cooper, alongside the FEMA administrator, were in town yesterday talking about the recovery cleanups. They were over at the Asheville airport discussing some of that. Buncombe County officials saying that things are not moving as quickly as they need, as in many cases you're talking about life and death, with individuals being a couple of days without food and water. President Joe Biden will be making his way to the state later this week. He'll be here tomorrow to survey the catastrophic damage left behind. After a quick press briefing yesterday, reporters shouted some questions at the president about the work that he is doing on hurricane relief. Here was that exchange.
On the hurricane, Mr. President, why weren't you and Vice President Harris here in Washington commanding this weekend?
I was commanding. I was on the phone for at least 2 hours yesterday and the day before as well. I commanded. It's called a telephone. All my security.
Is it not important for the country to see?
That's the back and forth exchange as President Joe Biden was leaving the room. Reporters asking, why are you, what do you say to the people about the response? 2 hours on the phone yesterday. That would have been Sunday. 2 hours the day before. That would have been Saturday. Current Vice President and presidential candidate Kamala Harris made a pit stop at the FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C. yesterday as the federal response and state response continues on this storm. One interesting thing to note, and what we've got coming up tomorrow morning with Western North Carolina, so much damage and destruction, what kind of impact does this have on the upcoming election? And you might be saying, well, there's still a lot of efforts going on. Election day less than 35 days away. Entire towns and communities wiped off the map. Polling locations, towns completely gone. We'll chat with Teresa Opeka from the Carolina Journal on that coming up on a Wednesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. That's going to do it for this morning. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning at 5 right here on WBT.